disappointed in you. Why didn't you drop out of the conference? Well, now, Adolph Rupp doesn't drop out of the conference. I don't determine the policies of the University of Kentucky, and I never did. And when they say that I should have refused to play the Southeastern Conference teams, I don't refuse to play Southeastern Conference teams. I play the conference teams that the university says I must play.
Even though the league had voted down the proposition, word spread quickly throughout the South that the University of Kentucky had sought to desegregate the conference.
Forget the basketball. Forget the player. It was important to him for a social issue. It was only right. As he said, it's only right. We're the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and every citizen and every student and a basketball player of every school should be able to come and play at the University of Kentucky.
The backlash found its way to Lexington.
Dear Mr. Dickey, your willingness to integrate athletic teams in the Southeastern Conference is repugnant and sickening. If you wish to dishonor the University of Kentucky in such a manner, you should at least have the decency to abstain from influencing other schools to choose the same shameful course. If you wish to surrender the dignity of Kentucky to the NAACP and other lawless and rabble-rousing gangs, why don't you withdraw from the conference and let other schools do as they wish? The sickening thing being forced on free citizens is a crime against the white race and a disgrace to decency. The letter was signed Presley J. Snow of Philadelphia, Mississippi.
My dear Dickie Bird, hasn't the integration in Louisville paused? Seems to me I read we're as less than initiated. Please write me, and do try to keep the South at least white. The unsigned letter was sent from Richmond, Virginia.
Dear Mr. Dickey, my heart and my mind are so burdened with the tragic and unnecessary circumstances that will eventually lead us to chaos and disaster unless something isn't done to prevent it. I cannot refrain from pleading that you do all within your power to enforce racial segregation, to prevent the awful catastrophe that will befall us if a halt is not called. My heart aches especially for our innocent, helpless youth, for if they are forced to have to associate with Negroes, that will lead occasionally to intermarriage. And what could possibly be worse? Let each race live among themselves according to God's plan. The letter was signed, Sincerely yours, a distressed mother.
Rupp and Reed received several death threats, which were forwarded to the FBI.
I had 12. Absolute, no question about it, death threats that were turned over to the FBI. And Mr. Rupp I know he had above 120. We'd open up the mail. Of course, Mr. Rupp got meant more than me, but then he'd call me in and say, this one's for you.
And not all of it came from well below the Mason-Dixon line.
This isn't going to sit well with some people, probably, but I think you have to recognize, too, that not only was there racism, pretty strong racism in the South during that time. There was some pretty strong racism in the state of Kentucky. You know, you can ask anybody that grew up in Louisville during that time of integration, or anybody in eastern Kentucky where there were very few blacks, or in western Kentucky where there were practically no blacks. And it was a time of where racism was not an abstract. You know, people think of Kentucky as being a border state and so on, but it was far from being void of racism. Matter of fact, and I don't know that I've ever said this publicly, but it doesn't matter, some of the worst hate mail I got when I integrated the program at Alabama came out of Louisville, Kentucky, which was shocking to me.
Rupp was not oblivious to the potential dangers of integration. For years he had witnessed the animosity hurled at his all-white Kentucky teams throughout the South.
He said, what would you do to have me take these black kids down south? Now, he said, you've been going on trips with us. You can see the colored water fountains, the restrooms, the theaters, and all that, and you see how we're treated with our white players. What do you think would happen with the black players? And he had a point there.
You go to Auburn and places like that. I mean, it was rough being on Kentucky team, being all white. I mean, they hated us, Mississippi State and Auburn and places like that.
How was he going to take that player down to Oxford, Mississippi, or to Auburn, Alabama? You know, when they wouldn't let him stay in hotels, you know, they wouldn't let him eat in, in restaurants and stuff. And well, I heard a lot of stuff about that. He was he was very concerned about having somebody come to a team and be threatened or get hurt or physically abused or verbally abused, and he really spoke out about that a lot.
So the notion of taking the hated Wildcats on the road with black players was not made without serious consideration.
He had to take his players down there. We'd take the white players down there, and they would abuse them, especially in Starkville, Mississippi. I mean, like Cotton Nash got out of bounds, people sitting there pulling hair off his legs, and all kind of abuse the white players took. And he said, what would we do if we took our black players down there if we had any? So that preyed on his mind. Where would you feed them? Where would you house them? And that type of thing.
We weren't a group of people that were, beloved by anybody else in the conference. I mean, they hated us, and because we had been so successful.
They hated us. No. We'd go down there and play. They hated us.
Rupp had hired Reed as a full-time assistant because Reed had coached and taught black youngsters at the high school level. He said even though the league and a vocal portion of fans resisted integration, they never gave up on the idea. They just had to proceed at a different pace.
We were kind of by ourselves. And did a lot of commiserating. We were on the highway a lot and did a lot of commiserating. But he understood, and he understood you can't change a culture. It was happening so fast.
Dickey left the university in 1963, but not before restating his support for integrating the SEC. And he found an ally in the school newspaper. The Kentucky Colonel advocated the signing of black athletes. In an editorial, the Colonel said if UK was not allowed to proceed, it should leave the conference. Southern newspapers responded.
Adolph Rupp, relegated to an also-ran status most every year in the Southeastern Conference basketball race, which he once dominated, has agitated for the chance to recruit Negro players. Now he's been joined by the University of Kentucky student newspaper. The Colonel goes the barren one step, though. It wants out of the SEC to boot, which is perfectly all right here. Written by Lee Baker in the Jackson, Mississippi Daily News in February of 1963.
We see where the editor of the University of Kentucky student newspaper has advocated the withdrawal of the university from the Southeastern Conference for the express purpose of recruiting Negro athletes. We have been deceived for many years by the fact that Kentucky is a Southern university. Just what makes them think that they know anything about the South? The editor says he is sick and tired of the doctrine of racial inferiority being rammed down our throats. It is not the doctrine of racial inferiority that has been rammed down the throats of Kentucky, but the foul taste of defeat on the football field year in and year out. Written by Eddie Dean in the Columbus, Mississippi Commercial Dispatch in March of 1963.
It was a time when we wanted to move faster than we were able to, we'll put it that way, and that's always a distressing sort of situation.
In 1963, the country was boiling. African Americans had found a national voice in Martin Luther King, whose letter from Birmingham jail urged his followers to disobey unjust laws. In May of that year, Birmingham police used fire hoses and attack dogs on black demonstrators. 2.5 months after the murder of NAACP Field Secretary Medgar Evers, King delivered his I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C. Less than 3 weeks later, another tragedy made national headlines. 4 little girls murdered in a church firebombing in Selma, Alabama. During the 63-64 school year, young men on college campuses discussed and debated the civil rights movement, but another topic took precedence. Vietnam.
That was probably the overriding factor on campus when I was in school at the University of Kentucky, because we were intimately involved in what was going to happen in that war in Southeast Asia, because we could be going over there.
Rupp concerned himself with his basketball team, still looking for that first black signee, and he believed the first African American ever to play for the Wildcats would have to be special both on and off the floor.
I think he envisioned that the first black player coming into his program needed to be an Alex Groza, or needed to be a Ralph Beard, or needed to be a Cliff Hagan or a Frank Ramsey. And I think for that reason, perhaps, they missed out on some kids who, obviously had a lot of other places they could go, very highly recruited and so on. And yet he wanted that first player to be one to come in and know that he could succeed on the court as well as off the court.
Through his friend, former baseball commissioner Happy Chandler, Rupp sought advice from someone who'd walked a similar path. Branch Rickey, the man who'd signed Jackie Robinson, the first African-American in the modern history of the major leagues.
I wrote down what he said. The first thing he said, that the youngster you take must be a Kentuckian, must be an excellent student, must be without question, as with Jackie. Nobody's going to keep him on the bench. Going to be something, especially if it's something you need. And boy, we needed centers.
Rupp thought he had found his man, Wesley Unseld, a powerful 6'7" center who led Louisville Seneca to back-to-back Kentucky State championships.
There was no finer youngster. And we had great youngsters. I said no finer. Because we had great youngsters. I don't think any of them were finer than another. But there is no finer person, certainly not a player, which he proved how good he was.
I told Coach Rupp, I said, you know what? I said, I think we really ought to try to recruit him. I said, could I make a trip down there to talk to him? He says, absolutely. So I drove to Louisville, went down, sat down with him, and really tried to get him to come to the University of Kentucky. I said, Wes, if you'll come, I said, I think we've got a chance to win a national championship.
He was a great, great player. I played against him a couple of times when he was at Seneca and I was at Lafayette, and he was not only a great player. I mean, he was just a great person.
All the kids wanted him. They're not stupid. When anybody could rebound like him, I mean, he led the NBA in rebounding.
If Wes Unseld had been our center on that 66 team, how good would we have been? I mean, we'd have been 2 games better, I can tell you that. But this was a player that was a very unique individual.
Unseld's academic record, like his play under the boards, was rock solid.
And athletically, I was probably the top recruit in the country. So there was pressure from the black community, the black civil rights leaders, local civil rights leaders, for me to do this, to go to Kentucky and to be the first in the SEC. And most people don't know I was the first in the ACC being recruited too.
According to one of the myths surrounding Unseld's recruitment, he was introduced at a Kentucky game in Memorial Coliseum and was roundly booed. Truth is, Unseld was booed in the Coliseum as he and his Seneca teammates played in the state tournament.
Wes was booed at the game, and it's been said that that was a racial thing, but it wasn't. It was just a typical state tournament crowd pulling for the little underdog, Breckinridge County. And the evidence of that is that Breckinridge County had more African-American starters than Seneca did.
His team was booed by the fans, but it wasn't because he was black. It was simply because the mountain teams wanted to defeat the team from Louisville. And in those days, the Louisville teams were tremendous basketball teams.
That was partly because we were from Louisville. We were a big school. We were playing a small school. I think a lot of that had to do with that. And then there was, of course, the rumors that I might be going to Kentucky.
It was easy to see why Unseld would believe some didn't want him at UK.
I started getting the threats in the mail and the dead chickens and all that kind of stuff.
In the early 1960s, I mean, that was dangerous. That was dangerous when you talk about, because one, when you look at the University of Kentucky, there was always a tremendous amount of hostility awaiting, the players from the University of Kentucky when they arrived at some of these SEC schools. But, one can only anticipate, how that hostility would have been elevated with the presence of a black player. Obviously, that was a concern. But, I don't want to, overlook the fact that, that hostility was also very present on the University of Kentucky's campus.
Still, Rupp persisted in his own way. Today, head basketball coaches spend nearly as much time on the road recruiting as they do in the gym. Back then, Rupp sent representatives to scout Unseld and to talk to him and his family.
I never spoke to Lancaster. I never spoke to Rupp. And everyone, especially my high school and around,